Nous allons maintenant démarrer cette première séquence d'ouverture qui s'appelle Préambule, première table ronde, si vous voulez, quel impact de la crise sanitaire sur notre perception de la crise climatique. Donc j'appelle mon collègue animateur Denis Chessou, journaliste, chroniqueur, présentateur de radio, dont CO2 mon amour depuis bien longtemps, 88, sur France Inter. Il est spécialisé sur les questions d'environnement et pourra donc interviewer très justement tous les participants. Je vais demander également à David Livingstone de le rejoindre sur scène. David Livingstone est conseiller principal auprès de John Kerry, envoyé spécial du président des États-Unis d'Amérique pour le climat. David Livingstone, on m'a envoyé un SMS me signalant qu'il était bien arrivé. Good morning. Pour ouvrir cette table ronde, deux questions à David Livingstone. La première concerne les deux crises que l'on traverse actuellement au même moment. David Livingstone, we face two crises at the same time, the health crisis and the climate crisis. So, in the United States of America, what are the impacts of the first one, the COVID-19 pandemic that we try to manage now, and the perception and management of the second one, the climate crisis, which is fast approaching?
Merci et d'abord, bonjour à tous. J'aimerais tout d'abord remercier M. Jean-Louis Ball et le Syndicat des énergies renouvelables pour leur invitation à cette importante conférence, événement. C'est un honneur pour moi d'avoir invité et d'être ici aujourd'hui et d'avoir l'occasion de discuter des questions si conséquentes. Je vais parler en anglais parce que c'est plus facile pour moi, mais je voudrais dire thank you very much. And the United States is very pleased to be here at SER's 22nd annual conference. I'm glad we're able to finally be together again amidst COVID. I also wanted to recognize as well the leadership of President Macron, of Minister Pompili, and of IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol, whose presentations were illuminating and timely. I also want to say that your commitment to tackling the climate challenge and to growing not only the French renewable sector and the French clean energy sector, but indeed to investing in the strengths of the transatlantic relationship and growing the transatlantic clean energy and renewable sector are critical and have never been more important. Let me give a few comments on this interesting question of COVID and its relationship to the climate challenge. As we know, fundamentally, COVID has previewed and tested our ability to deal with existential challenges in our interconnected world. Obviously, we are still at a very difficult time in the pandemic. Despite the fact that we're gathered here today in this grand venue, in this beautiful building, albeit with reduced numbers, the virus is hardly abated in many parts of the world. There are still too many people at risk of severe illness and even death, hospitalization, and severe impairment. And so while we've had extraordinary technological development in terms of vaccines helping to ease the crisis, we're obviously not yet through it. And it's as much a social challenge as it is a technological one. I think we see reverberations of that in our climate challenge as well. Our efforts to address the virus have also required tremendous resources, to be sure, in terms of time, capital, attention, political will. But like climate change, in terms of the costs, there's still far less to address the crisis than to avoid it or ignore it. As Secretary Kerry has said, the suffering of COVID will be magnified many times over in a world that does not grapple with and ultimately halt the climate crisis. We don't have the luxury of waiting until COVID is vanquished to take up the climate challenge. And I think that's important to remember. So let me say just briefly, what is the United States doing about it? Let me lay out that there are three basic pillars of our climate diplomacy when I think about it. There's getting the United States on track. There's exercising U.S. leadership. And then there's accelerating the clean energy transition, which is what many of you are also involved in leading and at the vanguard of. In terms of getting the U.S. on track, or getting our own house in order, so to speak, one of the very first actions that President Biden took upon entering the Oval Office was to sign the papers necessary to get the United States back in the Paris Agreement. That was completed as of February 19th. The United States is back. But it's not just enough to symbolically rejoin, to be back in the tent, to be back at the table. We also needed to bring something to show our seriousness. So the United States worked at record speed, day and night, 24 hours a day, to develop and to ultimately submit a new nationally determined contribution, a new 2030 goal. It was important for us to be standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder with our European counterparts on this, to have similar ambitions as we look towards the 2030 horizon. So we have a 50 to 52% greenhouse gas reduction target to 2030, very similar to that of the EU. We developed and announced also a climate finance plan. This was initially very significant in that President Biden announced the goal of doubling United States climate finance, and in fact tripling the amount of climate finance aimed towards adaptation. But at UNGA a few weeks ago, President Biden upped the ante again. He announced a doubling of our doubling, which now will represent a quadrupling of climate finance, not from President Trump levels of climate finance, but President Obama levels. So a significant investment in the seriousness with which we take the climate crisis, not just within U.S. borders, but globally, recognizing that this is truly a crisis without borders. In addition to this, there's been leadership domestically in terms of the investments that we're making. There's a robust infrastructure plan that involves new incentives and investments for solutions ranging from carbon capture to grid upgrades to electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and beyond. And I know for many of the innovative companies assembled here today, we very much hope that the United States will be a compelling market, a fast-growing market that can accommodate multiple different approaches and technologies, sizes of projects, and scales in the years ahead. Now, the second pillar, U.S. leadership on global climate ambition. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the example of that leadership in the appointment of Secretary John Kerry to serve as our first special presidential envoy for climate. We've had special envoys before, but never ones that report directly to the President of the United States, that have a direct line to the White House, and that have served decades in the United States Senate and at the highest tiers of government as Secretary of State. It's a signal of the seriousness with which the U.S. takes the climate crisis. In addition, the most significant foreign policy gathering of the first 100 days of this administration was the White House Leaders Summit on Climate, President Biden's Climate Summit. We gathered over 40 different leaders and heads of state. We reconvened the Major Economies Forum. We brought together 60 additional ministers in robust discussions and delivered new 1.5 degrees C aligned climate commitments for the 2030 and 2050 time horizon from the United States, Japan, Canada, and guarantees of similar commitments in the future from several other countries, South Korea, South Africa, et cetera. Now, in addition to this, we've reconvened the Major Economies Forum yet again just a few weeks ago. President Biden gathered around the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, heads of state once more. And this also saw the launch of a new U.S. initiative, jointly with the European Union, called the Global Methane Pledge, that will seek to address methane emissions as well. Now let me come finally to the item of probably greatest interest this morning, which is accelerating the clean energy transition. President Biden, Secretary Kerry, and so many others have underscored the fact that America's commitment to leading a clean energy revolution will create jobs, will create inclusive growth. it's an opportunity as much as it is a challenge. Already last year, in a COVID year, global investment in the energy transition surpassed $500 billion. But that's just a small share of what we can expect. Looking ahead, the global market for clean energy is poised to expand rapidly to more than $6 trillion a year by 2050. Global investment in new clean power capacity alone is set to exceed $10 trillion through mid-century, more than 6 times the investment in dirtier options. Green energy is no longer alternative energy. Green energy is the energy market, and it is the future of where capital flows and where policy attention will be. In the US, there are already 3.6 million jobs in advanced energy alone, and that was 2 years ago for the latest available data. That's more jobs than we have in retail. That's twice as many jobs as we have in hotels. And that's 3 times as many jobs as exist in oil and gas in the United States today, even with the United States being a quite significant hydrocarbon producer. In fact, there are only 3 job categories that the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States projects will grow by more than 50% over the next decade. One, of course, is a nurse practitioner. You can see that in the health crisis we find ourselves in and some of the challenges that we face in the decades ahead. But the other 2 are wind turbine service technician and solar photovoltaic installer. Now, we're not just counting on the market to grow by itself, we're also taking concrete actions. The Department of Energy has announced a hydrogen earthshot, a clean hydrogen earthshot, which seeks to take the price of clean hydrogen and put it on parity with the price of hydrogen produced in a more carbon-intensive fashion. We're aiming to get the price of clean hydrogen down to $1 for 1 kilogram within 1 decade by 2030. That's 1 for 1 in 1 for the very first element of the periodic table. If we can do that, and if we can work closely with our European partners on that, we'll be contributing significantly to driving a new source of demand for clean energy and renewables in the decades ahead. I'd just like to mention 2 other things very quickly. One other is the clean energy deployment work that we're working on with a number of different countries. We're working to roll out a new initiative at COP26 that will signal demand for clean energy and other complementary clean technologies in the decade ahead, starting with the power sector, of course, and trying to signal demand for mature renewable energy technologies so that suppliers and also the financial community feels confidence that there will be off-takers, not just in our markets on either side of the Atlantic, but also in fast-growing clean energy markets around the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and beyond. And we're also working on hard-to-abate sectors, steel, shipping, aviation, cement, aluminum, trucking, et cetera, to create 2030 green demand signals for green concrete, green cement, for sustainable aviation fuels, et cetera, that will help create confidence in investments today to make sure that those green products are there at scale when we reach the end of this decade. Now, finally, I just want to note that with the privilege of being back in Paris, having spent more than a year here when I was younger, having studied in this beautiful city, and being married to a French citizen as well, I just want to take a moment to appreciate that we cannot do this alone, that we will have to work very closely across the transatlantic community with our French partners on all of these issues. France has been a global leader in advancing climate action for decades. Of course, it was also the host of COP21, which led to the creation of the Paris Agreement, where the pivotal Paris Agreement was signed. And it's long been a champion of advancing multilateral solutions to tackle the world's toughest problems. Secretary Kerry was just at the One Planet Sovereign Wealth Fund Summit, hosted by President Macron. And it was terrific to sit in a room with trillions of dollars of capital under management assembled to discuss some of the truly substantive and material challenges, but also opportunities in aligning global capital flows with the transition to a net zero economy by mid-century. This is just the beginning of the conversation, I'm sure, not the end of it. And we greatly look forward to working closely together in this partnership across finance, across technology, across innovation, deployment, policy, and beyond, to make sure that this decade, this crucial decade, is one where we look back in 2030 and we say that we, together, created hope that by 2050 we can be where we need to be to keep this planet a safe one. Thank you very much.